Okay, I want to talk about change number 2 now, and that's the shift to food production, which started about 10,000 years ago, as far as we can tell from the archaeology. And of course, our understanding is always evolving, pun intended, but as far as we know, about 10,000 years ago. So I want to talk about the idea of a food revolution. Okay, a food revolution. And I don't mean hipster foodies blending two random cuisines together and thinking they came up with something super cool. I'm talking about the fact that about 10,000 years ago, the way things had been being done for thousands and thousands and thousands of years among hominids suddenly shifts dramatically. So about 10 to 8,000 years ago, we have the domestication, or we have humans start to domesticate plants, start to go from eating kind of just wild plants that they find to start domesticating plants. And also a few thousand years after that, start domesticating food animals. So things like squash in Central America, things like wheat in Mesopotamia / the Middle East, and things like rice in East Asia. And then that's followed by a whole bunch of other stuff. Corn a little bit after, or maize a little bit after that. Millet in Eastern Africa a little bit after that. All around the world. Kind of all in this semi-equatorial belt, a little bit north of the equator, which actually gives you a clue to why all this happened. But the point is, we suddenly people start controlling plants and domesticating plants. They start farming, basically. They also start herding. They start domesticating animals. And we call that the Neolithic Revolution. It's this widespread shift. Not all societies. There are tons still of hunter-gatherer societies at this point in human history. And indeed, there have been for the last 10,000 years, and there are still societies today. For example, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Aceh of Paraguay, they're still largely hunter-gatherer and foraging societies. And indeed, there are many societies here in Alaska where foraging and hunting are still very, very much an important part of food life, if not the only part of food life. So it's not that hunter-gatherers sort of go away at this point, but that many societies shift over at this point to food production. They go from getting the food from the environment to changing the environment to get it to produce the food they want. And that is a huge, huge, huge deal. You might not think it's much of a big difference, right? Well, what does it matter if you hunt a moose versus raise a cow and eat a cow, right? The moose tastes a little bit different, but whatever. No, this change is huge. It leads to the rise of cities, huge cities. It leads to the rise of writing. It leads to the rise of groups that are larger than, 50, 100 people. It leads to formal governments, and specifically governments with bureaucracies, governments that can tax, and governments that can do things like impose a death penalty or imprison you, which did not exist, as far as we can tell, until about 10,000 years ago. It leads to economic specialization. Think of your major. What is your major? Is your major, you're going into law, you're going into becoming a biology, you're going to be a fisheries biologist, you're going to go work in rehabilitative care, you're going to be a social worker, you're going to work in oil. None of those jobs would exist without the shift to food production, because you would need to be involved full-time in food collection. Food production produces the surplus that allows for economic specialization, that allows for the fact that we can have dozens of different majors and career paths here on campus. So this is truly a revolution in what it means to be a human being when this happens, and it shapes everything. And it even shapes life in many cases for different foraging groups around at this time, because part of what this is associated with is that some of the groups that shifted over to food production become empires, right? Like the Dynasty in Mesopotamia, like the various Chinese empires, like eventually the Mayan Empire, the Olmec Empire, and they push hunter-gatherer groups off into the marginal lands, which is why nowadays you oftentimes find hunter-gatherer groups in places like the middle of the rainforest, the far north, Kalahari Desert, those kinds of places. So these you start to see the birth of empires. So for better or worse, and frankly some of both, you have these huge changes when the food changes. So you've heard you are what you eat. I don't know if that makes sense nutritionally, but it is certainly true anthropologically. The way we eat shapes everything. So for the majority of the fossil record of Homo sapiens, as far as we can tell from physical anthropology, it's foraging, it's food collection. And the principle of foraging is making use of the already available food resources, going out and gathering plant resources, hunting meat resources, fishing for fish resources. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how that would have looked for most of human history, and then I want to talk about how farming changed everything. But before I can talk about either, I want to explain a little concept called cultural ecology and the culture core. I try to keep abstract anthropology theory out of these lectures to not bore you to death, because I know most of you aren't anthro majors and don't really care. But I'd like to teach you one anthropology theory that I think is very useful for all of us, whatever our major. There's a guy, Julian Stewart. Back in the 30s, 40s, he came up with a theory called cultural ecology and the idea of the culture core. And the idea basically goes something like this: how people adapt to their environment and what environment they're in matters a lot for all sorts of other parts of their society. He says you can think of it as kind of a core. At the core is the environment that people find themselves in and the technology they have to adapt to it. So for example, if you are a hunter-gatherer group living in an arid desert and the type of technology you have is bows and arrows, that gives you your core. And then from that is going to come out a bunch of other stuff that's related to that. It's going to affect sort of your population size, whether you're mobile or stay in place, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's going to affect a whole lot of other stuff, like what kind of social institutions you have to maintain control, what kind of political institutions. And that might even affect more things like religion. Now, his point wasn't that environment shifts everything or that food shifts everything. He fully acknowledged, like, hey, there's a lot of other stuff going on with societies. But his point was the way a society adapts has ramifications, reverberations throughout the whole society. The way they get food has reverberations throughout the whole society. And we can totally see that as anthropologists when we look nowadays at different groups of people and the way they make a living. So let's talk specifically about foraging. And I think it's worth learning about hunter-gathering or foraging. So this is sometimes called foraging or sometimes called hunter-gatherers. It's really worth learning about this because this seems to have been the default mode of hominins for thousands of years prior to the Neolithic Revolution. For the vast majority of hominin history, hominins were foragers, hunter-gatherers. This is the default mode. It's agriculture. That's the weird thing that came afterwards, that came pretty recently. So with foraging, you have these societies that, well, first of all, we will say, environmentally speaking, typically highly sustainable. There are exceptions. Some people argue that early indigenous American groups might have wiped out the mammoth species in North America. That's very debatable, and a lot of other scientists, I would say the majority view is that instead it was environmental changes and pathogens. So with those kind of weird counter exceptions that we're not even sure about and are kind of still debating, by and large, forager groups or hunter-gatherer groups have been very, very sustainable historically and throughout hominin history for the first, again, thousands and thousands of years. Things were very, very sustainable. And by that I mean there was use of the environment without sort of causing other things typically to go extinct or causing resources to decline to the point where the human group itself gets wiped out. And it kind of makes sense that that would be the case, right? With hunter-gatherer groups, you have these small groups. They're typically moving around to make use of resources, giving each other wide berth so that everybody has enough resources, so it's a low population density. And generally speaking, people use what's available in the environment. And then if something becomes too hard to hunt or gather, aka if it's been gathered or hunted too much, people typically move on to another resource or move territories. And so it makes sense if you have a group that's low population density and moves around when resources get scarce, it's going to be pretty sustainable. You add to that the fact that many indigenous hunter-gatherer groups across the world specifically have some kind of religious or spiritual system that emphasizes sort of respect for animals and proper use of animals and things like that. And I think that probably just adds to the equation where, generally speaking, forager societies are quite sustainable. That doesn't mean they never modified their environment. So for example, Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years have been modifying the Australian outback by intentionally setting fire to it to promote grasslands rather than trees, right? When you set fire to a landscape, and you can see this if you drive through the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, what happens when you set fire to a landscape is that you essentially reset the ecosystem clock. You reset it back to grasslands, you reset it back to flowers and grass, and then over time it becomes trees again. So in the Australian outback, Aboriginal groups for tens of thousands of years have set fire to the outback to make it be grassy so that it will promote kangaroos, and they still do that today. And so this is sometimes called fire stick farming. So because the kangaroos prefer grass, and of course the humans prefer to eat the kangaroos. Yum. So there's definitely been modification of the environment so long as humans have been messing around with fire and other things like that. But by and large, again, pretty sustainable, pretty low impacts on the environment. But what about socially? Back to that idea of a culture core. How does it affect, what did societies look like? What do we know about what societies probably looked like prior to agriculture, prior to domesticating things? Well, when we look at modern foraging societies, when we look at groups like the Hadza, when we look at groups like the Juk Hwanzi, which have been extensively, a lot of people have gone and spent time with the Juk Hwanzi and written about their experiences there, which is a Southern African hunter-gatherer group. If you think about, let's say here in Alaska, what Inupiaq groups were doing, what Yupik groups were doing, what Dena'ina groups were doing prior to European colonialism, when we look at groups like the Goshut in Utah, when we look at groups like the Ache in Paraguay, we come up with the fact that it's really, really diverse, really, really depends on the groups. You have groups like the Wakwa or the Dena'ina that had these very large villages traditionally prior to colonialism, and hundreds potentially, or even potentially thousands of people. But for a lot of the hunter-gatherer groups, what we see is that that's the exception rather than the rule. That for a lot of the hunter-gatherer groups, what you had was a very low population density. You had small mobile bands. So what I mean by a mobile band is a group of people that can move around relatively easily whenever they need to because a resource is drying up or because the caribou have suddenly moved to a different area. Small because foraging can only support so large of a population. When you have to go find the things, when you have to go find the plants that are edible out of the hundreds of plants in your environment that aren't edible, when you have to go find the meat that you can catch out of the hundreds of animals that either can't be caught or are not edible or are not preferred, the population density of foraging is usually quite low. Again, there are definitely exceptions. And being here in Alaska, we've got several exceptions, such as the Dena'ina and Tlingit, and many others. But generally speaking, foraging groups in a lot of the rest of the world, however, such as Africa, such as various parts of Southeast Asia, such as various parts of South America, would have been these small mobile bands. And your band would generally have been your extended family group, or other people that were kind of affiliated with you for the time being. And if the hunter-gatherer groups of most of human history were anything like the hunter-gatherer groups now, and we have every reason to believe they would have been highly egalitarian. And what I mean by highly egalitarian is highly equal. There's nobody that can come in and say, hey, I'm the king of this hunter-gatherer band or the queen of this hunter-gatherer band. If you don't do things the way I like, I'm going to send my goons after you and execute you. That doesn't exist in hunter-gatherer societies, generally speaking, and as far as we know, that didn't exist for most of human history. There wasn't true government. And what I mean by true government, I want to clarify what I mean. I don't mean that there wasn't leaders. There's certainly leaders in hunter-gatherer groups. There's certainly, for example, in Hwanzi groups, traditionally hunter-gatherer groups, headmen of hunter-gatherer groups that help decide sort of, hey, here's where we should camp for the night, or hey, we should probably go hunt in that direction. But the point is, when they make decisions, their decisions are respected because they're respected, right? There's somebody that everybody knows really well. Again, it's a group of like 20 to 50 people. People know who the leader is. He became the leader not because he inherited it or she inherited it, but because they're well known for their skill in hunting or in decision making. And generally speaking, if there's any sort of important decision to make, everybody sits around the camp and talks about it. That's so different, right, than what we experience nowadays. If you, let's say, think that you should be allowed to speed down Old Seward Highway on your way down to visit the peninsula, and you get pulled over by a trooper, it's not as if you can be like, well, I mean, you think I was going too fast, but I don't think I was going too fast. I think I was fine. That's not how it works, right? The trooper will say, well, there's something called a law, and you are getting a ticket now, right? And depending on the nature of the violation, you could end up under arrest or even in a thing called a prison, right? Or a jail where you are actually physically confined. Similarly, you can't just voluntarily choose to not pay your taxes. The IRS will come and garnish your wages. And if you chose to flagrantly disobey different kinds of laws, this can result in imprisonment or even physical harm to you. That seems normal to us because we grew up with it. But for the vast majority of human history, even to some degree after agriculture, but especially before agriculture, that was not normal. And that's not normal for many hunter-gatherer groups before colonialism happens, before a larger empire absorbs them in. That's not the human default. The human default is not to have what we sometimes call the legitimate use of violence, the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence. What we mean by that is governments are allowed to physically control their subjects. That's not the default. That was something that arose over time. As far as we know for most of hominin history, that didn't exist. So now I'd like to ask you a question, which is, would you like to have been a forager back, let's say 20,000 years ago, or one of the foraging groups today? Well, again, it's hard to know exactly what foraging life was like 20,000 years ago. We can come to some kind of conclusions. We know, for example, that the diets were very diverse, as you read about in the book. You read about how, we can go and dig up coprolites, which are basically fossilized poop, and then analyze them and see that, ancient foragers, for example, in Texas were eating 20 different kinds of plants and 6 different kinds of meat, which is probably a lot more diverse than your diet. Your diet, if it's anything like mine, probably relies really heavily on 1 or 2 kinds of meats and maybe 3 or 4 different kinds of plants. And so they had very diverse diets. We know that they were hunting with things like projectile points relatively early on, that there were things like atlatls. But what else do we know about them? Well, a lot of what we know about ancient hunter-gatherers are partly from observing present-day hunter-gatherers and saying at least some of the dynamics were probably the same. Obviously, groups that are hunter-gatherers now are dramatically different than 20,000 years ago. Their societies have changed like anybody else's societies have changed over 20,000 years. But there's at least some broad similarities there. So one of the similarities there is that they weren't poor. So we oftentimes have this assumption that like foraging groups were sort of scrubbing out an existence and constantly hungry prior to the rise of agriculture, or that modern hunter-gatherer groups are. And that does not appear to be the case when we look at modern foraging groups. And to the extent that there are foraging groups that have been impoverished, it's typically because they've been pushed to the margin by empires. So prior to the rise of empires, when forager groups would have had the best lands, there's no reason to think that they would have been particularly poor. What they would have been poor in were things like big screen TVs and large houses, right? If you're a mobile group, you're not building huge settlements. Again, except for certain exceptions, like coastal groups that can depend on salmon. You're not building huge houses and having these huge elaborate possessions. But, is that the only kind of wealth? One could argue that another form of wealth is land wealth and natural capital, large amounts of land to roam in and to use for any resources that you need. And foragers had that in abundant supply. The population densities were really low, and if you needed to build something, you could go out and cut down a bunch of trees and have a bunch of wood to build things, which I know in Alaska you're like, yeah, that's what we do anyways, but for most of the world, that's not what you do. So foragers were arguably in some ways as wealthy as we are now, albeit a very different kind of wealth. Another misconception about modern foraging groups, as well as ancient foraging groups, is that they have to constantly hunt to survive. Farming's so much better because, it's much more reliable. Groups back in the day were starving half the time and had to hunt back half the time. Although that certainly may have been true of ancient hunter-gatherers, it's probably not, partly because it's certainly not true of modern hunter-gatherers. So as anthropologists did research with Aboriginal Australians early on in the colonial period, and still to this day, one of the things they observed is that Aboriginal Australians actually work fewer hours than most Americans. Aboriginal Australians are living in one of the hardest environments to be a forager, the Australian outback, and yet their work day is typically done by 3:45, and they took a nap in the middle. And they spent some of that time doing what you and I think of as home chores. So like you and I might work an 8-hour day and then come home and vacuum. For Aboriginal Australians, you would hunt in the morning, come home, take a nap, do some work on your house or, your tools, kind of sharpen your tools if they need to be sharpened, go out and do some gathering, and you're done for the day at 3:45. Who wouldn't love a schedule like that? What do you get to spend the rest of the time doing? I don't know. Crazy things like spending time with your children, teaching the sacred stories of your culture, dancing, singing music, basically all the things that make life deeply meaningful. So yeah, and this isn't just one example. There's many, many other examples that we could share of studies that have been done of hunter-gatherer groups, where generally speaking, hunter-gatherers work far fewer hours. It's 20 to 30 hours often, compared to what the average American works. Now, they don't necessarily have a weekend like some American workers do, but also, do you really actually have a weekend if your boss is emailing you over the weekend? So a lot of these groups are working, 4 to 7 hours, even under not the best conditions. And that's for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that hunter-gatherer groups typically have really diverse diets. And so it may take a lot of time to go hunt a giraffe. But if you don't find a giraffe one day, you can go eat a bunch of grubs, and grubs are, within 30 minutes. I did the math on this one time because I was interested in it. Within about 30 minutes or 20 minutes, you can gather up enough grubs to have the same calorie and protein impact that having like 3 boxes of Special K yogurt berries like that cereal can have. So basically the thing that would take us a couple hours potentially to work for, or at least an hour to work for, and then have to go to the store and buy it for the same caloric impact, it takes 20 minutes for a hunter-gatherer group. Just go find some grubs and start chowing down. Well, but they're unhealthy is another thing that people will sometimes say. Aboriginal groups are, sure, okay, they had plenty of food, they didn't work as many hours, and they arguably have their own forms of wealth, and they have a bunch of leisure time, but they're unhealthy. Yes and no, not really, right? So when we talk about foraging groups anciently, one of the things we notice in the fossil record is that the human life expectancy actually decreased when humans shifted to agriculture. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is that humans started living a lot closer to animals. And as a result, they were around a lot more animal dung. And as a result, they were getting a lot more diseases, zoonotic diseases. COVID right now is an example of an extremely dangerous type of zoonotic disease that has reached pandemic status. But zoonotic diseases are something that have been with humanity to some degree from the beginning, or at least the beginning of agriculture, right? When humans were living on top of other animals, livestock animals like cows. There was also the fact that early agriculturalists were eating a lot of carbs, which an all-carb diet, different diets for different people, but an entirely carb diet, I don't think you're going to find any dietitian who says that's entirely good for you. So because of that, among other things, the human fossil record seems to indicate that people actually became less healthy when they first adopted agriculture, that the hunter-gatherers had a longer life expectancy prior to that. Now that shoots back up over time, especially as agriculture eventually leads to economic specialization, which eventually leads to doctors, which eventually leads to modern medicine. Okay, that's a huge benefit. But for much of human history, the life expectancy was longer than it was when initially there was the shift to agriculture. Modern hunter-gatherer groups do sometimes have a shorter life expectancy, certainly. On the other hand, there are health benefits. So this is if my screen will allow me to do this, this is a study that was done where they basically the scientists had a bunch of Hadza people strap heart monitors to themselves, basically, and then 19 men and 27 women with a mean age of 33, and then they tracked their heart rate over a 2-week period, and what they basically found was that their blood pressure, cholesterol, and other things for cardiovascular disease were fantastic. Nobody had a risk of heart disease. And they concluded that the reason for this probably is the Hadza people as hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and we can by extension say probably a lot of hunter-gatherers, are constantly doing low-grade exercise. They don't go to the gym to work out for 15 minutes, pumping iron. I don't know what kids say nowadays about working out. They don't try to get shredded. Instead, what they do is sort of just walk around all day to this thing or this thing that they got to do, bend down all day to go pick up roots and things out of the ground. It's low-grade exercise, nothing too intense, but it's all the time. Turns out that's really good for your heart health. And so just kind of keep moving. So it turns out hunter-gatherer groups are in some ways less healthy because of the lack of modern science, modern medicine, modern vaccines, in some ways more healthy in terms of certain kinds of preventable diseases. So in conclusion, foraging groups then, which is again the human default for most of hominin history, closely followed the environment, had a generally sustainable lifestyle, but were usually small, mobile bands without a whole lot of hierarchy, without a whole lot of large organizations. There was no writing system. There was no large organized priestly bureaucracy. There was no large government bureaucracy. Things just looked very, very different. And whether you think that's a good different or a bad different, I've not been trying to argue that hunter-gathering was better with my examples. I've instead been trying to say that some of the things we think are true of hunter-gatherers are not true. But certainly it's very, very different. Now, what does it look like once domestication happens, once the Neolithic Revolution happens?